What I put together here for you is a series of video tutorials, basically using Photoshop to design your own guitar. I found that it's very, very useful to do what we refer to as previs or pre-visualization in software to lay things out and to make sure that everything's going to work the way you want it to. Photoshop is a great tool for doing this. Just to give you an example of what we are going to be working for, open this file up. This is what we're shooting for. This is all done in Photoshop, all the lighting and shading. The only photograph that is actually used in this piece is the quilted maple that you see on the guitar top, and the pickups and that the control knobs and those sorts of things. The hardware basically was taken from other photographs, but the fretboard, the inlays, the frets, the binding on the fretboard as well as around the body, all created in Photoshop. And what we're going to do is take a real quick tour of Photoshop just to kind of get you familiar with the tools, because I know the guys that are just getting started in Photoshop find it a little bit challenging to find your way around, but it's really not that bad. The best thing to do is just get in there and dig in and start working with it and get used to the tools. But I'm going to give you just a really quick rundown of the tools we'll be using in this tutorial anyway. If you look on the left side of the screen is typically where this shows up, is our tool palette. And I should point out I'm using an older version of Photoshop. This is Photoshop 5. I do have CS4 extended on this machine, but for some reason the OpenGL acceleration that they now use in the current versions of Photoshop is not playing nicely with the scan converter that I'm using to record my desktop to DV tape. So I'm going to go ahead and do this tutorial in Photoshop 5, and of course all of the tools and techniques that we'll see here will definitely be available and translate to newer versions of Photoshop. Plus this will give guys that don't want to invest the huge money in a new version of Photoshop. You may be able to find an older version, 4 or 5 or even 6, online and get that for next to nothing, and this tutorial will still be useful for you. If I were to do it all in CS4, there's a lot of features and things in there that you would just be lost on in an older version of Photoshop. So here we go. The tool palette is in the upper left corner here. I have a pretty good selection of tools. The ones we're going to be using mostly will be our marquee selection tools, both the rectangle and the oval or ellipse tool. They basically, you click and drag out into your work area, and they create this little marching ants pattern that tells you part of that layer is selected, and whatever you do to that layer with the selection in place, I'll show you real quick with a blur filter, these marching ants or that selection limits the processing or whatever you're doing to the inside of that selection. It becomes basically a barrier to any of the pixels outside of that selection. You can see very clearly that our Gaussian blur is only affecting the pixels inside the selection. So let's be sure we remember that. That's real important, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. So you click and drag to create your selection. You click outside, and I'm doing all of this with the left mouse button. Click outside, clears the selection. Hit the fly out, select our rectangular tool, same thing. Click outside, clears the selection. We have the move tool, and the move tool lets you physically grab layers and move them around within the project, and we'll cover that more as we get into working with layers, and you'll see how that works. The magic wand tool is very useful for making selections. The way it works is it's set on a tolerance. We have really, I guess the widest range of contrast here, going black and white. So what the magic wand tool does is it will, if you click with the left mouse button, it selects all of the white pixels and will continue to make a selection outward from where you click until it encounters a darker pixel. And this is all based on tolerances. If there was a grayscale, if there were grayscale data between black and white, or gray or pixels between the black and white, based on the tolerance you have set for that tool, it would select until it hit that tolerance, and any pixels that fall outside that range would not be selected. So really what this is doing for us here is it is giving us a nice clean selection because we have only black and white pixels. So clicking on the white, or anywhere on the image for that matter, selects white pixels until it encounters black pixels, and then that ends the selection. Let's see here. The clone or stamp tool, and we may or may not use that. It basically allows you to sample part of an image onto another part of the image. If we use it, we'll cover that later on. The erase tool does exactly what it says. It erases. No big mystery there. And let's see, the gradient tool. We're going to use this quite a bit, not so much until we get into doing our lighting effects and shading and shadowing our top. But we will use both the circular gradient, which is selected now, and the linear gradient, which would be used for drawing effects like a horizon, or where a wall and a ceiling, or a wall and a floor might meet, or a wall and a ceiling. We'll be using a lot of that when we get into working with layer masks later on in the video series. The eyedropper, it lets you, wherever you click in the image, you can see my color is changing there. You know, as I click around in the image, I'm getting different values. Pretty basic tool. We have the zoom tool, and the zoom tool, as it displays when it's first selected, if you left mouse click, you see it has a little plus sign in the center. It just tells you when you use the left mouse button, it's going to zoom in for you. Now to zoom out, still using the same left mouse button, you hold down the Alt key on a PC, and you can see that that turns, when I hold the Alt key down, it's turning to a minus sign. You left mouse click and it zooms you back out. Another cool way to use this tool is just with it selected in the plus sign there, you can click and drag out a marquee with it, and it will zoom that portion of the image to fit the document size that you're working on. Another useful way to use it is if you double click it, it returns the document to 100% size. It's a little big for what we're doing here, so I'm going to hit my Alt key, get my little minus sign inside the magnifying glass there, and we're going to zoom back out where we can see our whole layout. The hand tool, very useful. If I was in at 100% magnification here, grab my hand tool. If I hold down the space bar, well, actually with the tool selected I don't have to do that. I can just click with the left mouse button and drag it around, and I'm not actually moving the layer, I'm moving the viewport. I'm moving this image within the viewport that I currently have, the zoom level that I currently have. That's a real important distinction. If you use the move tool and grab a layer and drag it around, the viewport stays the same. It's the layer is physically being moved within the project. But with the hand tool, it is just changing our viewport. You can see these sliders down here. When I move this around, that slider is moving. So it's only changing the viewport. Another cool little tip, say we have the zoom tool selected, or we'll come back to this, the pen tool, one of our Bezier tools. If I want to use this in conjunction, and I'm going to go ahead and grab this pen tool, and if I wanted to use it in conjunction with another tool, the hand tool in conjunction with another tool, all I have to do is hold down the space bar, and you see that that changes to the hand. And as long as I hold the space bar, I can click and drag within the project, and the hand tool will stay active. As soon as I let go of the space bar, we're right back to the tool we were using before. This is really helpful when you are doing various operations to an image and you want to zoom in tight but still be able to maneuver it without jumping back and over and hitting, keyboard shortcuts or grabbing another tool off the tool palette.